ch5. This is all your fault. That was what Abby had told Pete near the start of October, when everything had imploded and become such a mess. Sarah couldn't or wouldn't get involved when it all kicked off, and for a while, it was something that he even started to believe, but only for a time. When he thought about it objectively, Pete knew there was more to it than that. Pete liked the kind of people who took the time to understand, rather than instantly judging and applying labels. He liked the ones that only had an opinion after really getting to know everything, the ones that didn't take rumor as gospel, the ones that were real. In his mind, Pete was being overly criticized for life choices, when his accusers didn't know the price he'd paid for his actions. What he couldn't get his head around, though, was that while Abby had hurt him as much as he had hurt her, the only difference was that he'd tried to understand her situation, instead of just trying to hurt her back. Yet the same definitely couldn't be said for her. She was judgmental, harsh, and entitled. Pete had no idea where she had learned this sense of entitlement, certain that she didn't get it from him. This is all your fault. Although those words rung in his head, he knew that they were just not true. Abby was equally to blame for their need to leave Seattle, and he just wanted her to admit it, to own it, and to accept it. But still, as much as he knew that the likelihood of that happening was slim to n, somehow this was apparently all his fault. That was what they both must have been thinking. Pete could tell from their body language and the way they were basking in victim complexes and being martyrs. He was willing to accept that. At a push, it was majoritively his fault. Pete was the first one to admit that he was far from perfect, but at the same time he'd put up with a lot over the years. Sarah had it in her to be a complete bitch. Sometimes, usually after a drink or two, he tried his best to imagine her a villain in his story, to list all of the ways that she had ruined his life. In sobriety, though, he held no such views. Sometimes Pete wished that she had lied to him or cheated, or been abusive to him in any way. But she hadn't done those things. It would have been better if she had. Abby was no angel either. He was proud of his little girl and loved her unconditionally, but she was insufferable at times, and her issues had made bonding with her quite a challenge for Pete. In the backseat of a cab, he was left to make mundane small talk with the driver. The usual sort of thing, asking if he'd been busy, if he'd been out long, or was just starting his shift. The kind of thing that was universal in the back of a cab. The kind of things that the drivers must have just been in autopilot as they replied. Pete felt the hint of a smirk cross his lips as he supposed that one thing that was common elsewhere wouldn't be a subject here: the weather. Not as though anyone could say it was a cold one today. Pete glanced across at his family, there in the back with him. He'd normally have shared such a funny observation with Abby, and she would laugh. That wasn't going to happen now, though, if it did ever again. What his eyes beheld, though, was that they were napping. He saw them out of the corner of his eye, leaning against one another. Sarah gently ran her hand through Abby's hair while they held hands, angled away from him, facing the opposite window, much like it was a them and me situation. Like he was the enemy. It was on his mind to utter those thoughts about it not being fair, but since the move here had been his idea, Pete was willing to take the biggest share of the blame. The funny thing was that Pete had always wanted to visit Alaska. He'd always wanted to see Anchorage. Part of his was almost as naive as his daughter, although his preconceptions weren't of an all-white Alaska with fresh snow falling every minute, like some kind of snow globe. But rather he was picturing marbled green skies and the chance to see the northern lights at a whim. Instead, everything was basked in pitch black and shadow, and Anchorage looked just like any other city by night. Pete supposed that Ember Falls would be different. It was further out, more rural, but that might work in their favor. Seattle could sometimes be a little too much. There was always something going on, and it had become too busy. As Pete looked over at his wife, and she tried her hardest not to look in his direction, he continued to think about the life he'd left behind in Seattle, and how work had taken its toll on him, more than he let on to his wife. Perhaps if he'd shared more and not kept so much to himself, then they wouldn't be in this situation. That kind of thinking wasn't helpful to anyone, least of all to himself. A quick glance to the GPS on the cab driver's phone indicated that they were 2 minutes away. Pete reckoned that it would be good to stretch his legs after all of the napping that he did on the flight out here, reminiscing about just how comfortable the seats on the plane were.